So, do you think your memory is reliable? Well, we're going to find out how reliable your memory really is. Because I really do love, especially in a political season like this, when everybody says things that happened in the past, or do you remember this, or do you remember that? But how reliable is our memory? We're going to learn a whole lot about that and more with Dr. David Lavond. He's a professor in the psychology department at USC. He teaches memory, learning, and behavioral neuroscience. So let's welcome Dr. Lavond. Welcome, sir.
Thank you very much.
So this has been a fascinating topic for me because a lot of times I see it a lot in relationships. I'll keep the Valentine's theme going here. But we hear a lot of times when couples will say to each other, I have never said that, or you always do this. And obviously they're referencing the past, and they're counting on the assumption that their memory is pretty reliable. What do you think about that? Is that an accurate statement that the memory can be reliable?
It could be reliable. For most of us, it's not, because, for a couple of reasons. Well, one is we don't pay attention at the time we're creating the memory. That could be because we don't think it as important to us. And so clearly somebody who thinks that their relationship is more important to them will remember things better than somebody who just takes it for granted.
Well, that's a good point. I never thought about it that way. It sounds like then we can be a detriment to our own memory. You know what I mean by that is if we're angry, if we're defensive, we might remember the things we want to remember instead of what really happened.
Yeah, that's the case. There's a condition called state-dependent learning and state-dependent memory, which means that if we have learned something under one particular condition, it could be a memory, a mood condition, it could be a drug condition, but then later we go to retrieve it and we're in a completely different setting. We have a great deal of difficulty actually retrieving the memory in that particular time. So one of the things that can actually enhance memory is to try to recreate the settings and the conditions under which it was created in the first place.
Well, fascinating. That makes things even more challenging, especially in a heated argument or debate.
Right. Where you would see some benefits to it would be something like eyewitness testimony. So you would want to recreate the scene, the place, the time, the mood that you're in, things of that sort. On the other hand, for some relationships, so maybe there's some memories you don't want to remember, don't want to bring them up again.
You know, it's an interesting thing. I was just thinking right now about the political campaign season, and we see a lot of ads that hammer people day in and day out, negativity towards other candidates, and a lot of times fabricated lies. What's your take on some of these? In other words, if they say something like Ted Cruz is a sleazy politician, you see this over and over in an ad, it later disappears. Will you remember just those little taglines more so than anything else?
If you are inclined to that particular candidate, yes, you tend to remember those kinds of things. The negativity can be kind of tricky. There's actually a study that showed that they had a speaker come in and he told about a particular topic, let's say economics, and he said a lot of incorrect facts. In fact, he said deliberately, this is wrong. This is not the way it is. They tested their subjects later about what they remembered as being true facts, and they tended to repeat the things that they were told were incorrect.
Oh, by the person himself.
Right. So it actually turns out that the more times that you're warned, the more likely you are to retrieve those as true things when in fact they are not true at all.
That's a very scary concept.
Yes.
And you have a lot of politicians right now salivating as well. Especially on the debate stage. Well, it's funny because... Go ahead.
And on a debate stage, by the way, you may also forget who actually said what as well.
Oh, that's a good point, too. I don't know how much you follow politics, but I remember a gentleman by the name of Lee Atwater. Do you remember him?
The name's familiar.
He was a campaign manager, I think it was for Reagan and other Republican candidates, but he had a philosophy when I watched his movie. He passed away quite young, but he had a philosophy where he said, you just say it because at least a quarter of the people will believe it and half will remember it as being true. and he would just make up incredible stories, whatever it may be. Dr. Such and Such was in jail for the last 3 years, or was arrested for picking up a prostitute or something like that. And even though it wasn't real at all, but people would remember it, just like you said in your study example.
Yeah, well, one thing about that is if you say something in a story context, we tend to remember stories better than just isolated facts.
Oh, that's even more dangerous.
Yes.
Now, how about videos? Do we remember accurately? Because I know you mentioned earlier about eyewitness testimony. So if you saw something in a video, for instance, do we remember it well?
You're still subject to misperceptions and mismemories. There's a famous example that you can see on YouTube. It's some individuals that are in this video just wandering around in a room. And you're asked to count the number of times that a basketball is being passed from one person to the next. And in the middle of this, there's actually a person in a gorilla suit which wanders through this. You don't actually notice that. You don't report that. What you report is the number of passes. But you are completely oblivious to something which was pretty obvious once it's pointed out and is played back to you.
Yeah, that would be. What do they refer to? Inattentional blindness again? Is that what
Yes,
that is? Yeah.
exactly. Yes.
Yeah.
And so there are things like that, inattentional blindness or change blindness, any of these kinds of things. Attention is really important for what you're going to pay attention to and what you're going to remember. And in fact, I like to tell my students that the number one reasons why people forget things is because they never learned it in the first place. And what I mean by that is they never really paid attention to it in the first place.
Oh, that's interesting. So it really matters how much we focus and pay attention to whatever we're looking at or hearing?
Exactly. And so distractions are deadly for that, and they can be deadly in the real world. Talking on the phone while you're driving is not a good thing because if something all of a sudden happens that you have to react to, it's this blindness kind of thing. You just don't see it. You don't react fast enough.
Let me ask you this about false memories. What's going on there? Is there actual thing about and that's, I guess maybe not false memories, but memories that we can create that aren't really there?
Yes. So there have been a number of studies along this line. Elizabeth Loftus, who's now at UC Irvine, has done some interesting studies along that line. She, for example, conspired against a young individual by the name of Chris, and she conspired with his relatives and friends in such a way that she, at one point in her interview with Chris, asked him, "Have you ever been lost in a mall?" And he couldn't remember that because, in fact, that had never happened in his life. But he later went by and asked, his family, was I ever lost in a mall? And they would kind of lead him on to believe that something had happened, not entirely give him details. And the more that this thing happened, the more he incorporated this into his own memory, so that later he actually reported remembering being lost in the mall at one time.
Well, that's even scarier than what we talked about earlier.
Yeah, so it's actually fairly easy to induce false memories in a person, and probably about a third of individuals are really quite susceptible to that.
Do you think, and you can tell me what your opinion is on this, I know it's probably speculation, there was a study done years ago, or in a situation where it happened where people thought they were molested, but they actually implanted, I guess, false memories, whether unintentionally or intentionally. You remember that study a while back ago, or incident?
Yeah, there have been a number of cases where there have been accusations of molestation and other kinds of things. There's a famous case in the South Bay here of Los Angeles at the McMartin preschool, and it turns out that there's no physical evidence that this actually had occurred, and some people, were arrested and prosecuted and other kinds of things. I think that there may even still be a person in Washington State who is convicted of having had sex with his daughter. This was a memory that was retrieved during a therapeutic session with the daughter, It turns out that she was examined and she had never had sex, never was
Oh,
pregnant.
jeez.
And even though there's a completely false story, you know, people still, you know, believe in the legal system and, you know, that she was convicted, so it must be right. One of the things I tell my students in class is that when I'm listening to somebody on an eyewitness identification or on a witness stand telling me what has happened in a particular instance, I take that with a grain of salt. What I'm actually looking for is physical evidence, videotape, fingerprints, DNA evidence. Those kinds of things are much more reliable than the memory of a particular individual.
Yeah, it sounds like you have to take it more than a grain of salt. It might have to be like a cup full of salt.
Right.
Jeez.
Exactly.
And that's one of the reasons, I guess, in the legal world, they don't really count on eyewitness testimony very much, or do they?
Yeah, witnesses probably do. I don't know what the legal profession believes, but I do know that they have a document about worrying about how you do witness interviews, because you can lead them to report things that, in fact, were not part of their experience. That is, if the detectives mentioned something like, well, was he wearing a hat, and that had not been reported previously, well, they may incorporate later in their memory that, oh, he had a hat. You know?
Oh, jeez.
So that's an issue. There's a good way and a bad way to do lineups. If you do lineups where you have one person standing next to another or pictures right next to each other, it's kind of implied that the perpetrator is in this selection, and so you end up picking one of these individuals. It's better to actually present pictures by themselves and say, was this person the person or not? Because of just that comparison that you're doing amongst several selections. You just think that, well, I'm supposed to pick one of these. It must be one of these, otherwise they would have been showing me this.
Interesting. Yeah, I can see they're not going to count on eyewitness testimony very much. I know the media does, which is kind of, it cracks me up, because the media always say, well, you know, they had eyewitnesses that saw this. And I'm thinking, well...
Yeah, I would be very skeptical of it. There is just the general issue of confidence in having learned something. It's just because somebody is really confident about their memory does not mean that it actually happened.
That's a good point. We have about 2 minutes left. Dr. Lavond, any tips for us in regards to memory, whether to have better memory or ways to understand other people's possibility of having faulty memories as well as our own? Any tips at all?
Really, it's practice memory. If you look at the literature on experts, for example, it's not something that they were born with. It's something that they have, in fact, practiced throughout their lives. And one thing that we don't do is we don't tend to practice our memories in everyday life. And so then when we get older, you know, it looks like we're failing. And part of it is because we just haven't got good at recall.
Interesting. So you have to work it out like a muscle.
Right, exactly.
So chess would help, or ballroom dancing, or something like that?
There's not a lot of generalization. And what I mean by that is you can practice doing math problems. You can do Sudoku. You can play chess. You can become masters at each one of those. That's great. But if you want to say that that is going to make me an expert in something else, my memory is going to be better in something else, it turns out that doesn't happen.
Gotcha. Fascinating stuff. Fascinating. Dr. Lavond, thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you.
This is a fascinating interview. Dr. David Lavond at USC. Is there anything, any sites we can go to visit for you, or just your email at USC?
Just my email at USC. You can always take my classes.
There you go. Take his classes at USC, Dr. David Lavond, Lavond. Well, all I can say is I hope you remember this conversation and this interview.